In November 2010, the world was introduced to a haunting story of love, betrayal, and unanswered questions. Ani Dewani, a bright young woman from Sweden, had just married the love of her life, Shrien Dewani, a wealthy businessman from Britain. They were a couple full of dreams, embarking on their honeymoon in Cape Town, South Africa, a destination known for beauty and adventure. But in just a few days, this picturesque honeymoon would end in brutal tragedy. What was supposed to be a celebration of new beginnings became a horrifying mystery that would grip the media and audiences around the globe. Ani Hindoksha was born in 1982 in the small, peaceful town of Mariestad, Sweden, where her family had settled after fleeing political upheaval in Uganda. Raised in a supportive household, Ani grew up immersed in two worlds, blending her Indian heritage with her Swedish identity. Friends and family remember her as a ray of light, with a kindness and charisma that drew people in. She excelled in school and had a passion for design, with ambitions to build a career that reflected her creativity. For Ani, family was everything, and she was especially close with her parents and her brother Anish. In 2009, Ani's life changed forever when she met Shrien Dewani in London. Shrien, a British businessman from a prominent Indian family, was known for his charm and business acumen. He quickly captivated Ani with his confidence and sophisticated lifestyle, introducing her to a world of luxury. Friends and family saw them as a perfect match, sharing not only a cultural background, but also a love for family and tradition. Their romance blossomed, and it wasn't long before Shreen proposed, and the two began planning a grand wedding in India, intending to celebrate their union in style. In October 2010, Ani and Shrien's love was celebrated with a luxurious wedding in Mumbai, India. The event was a stunning display of tradition and joy, with hundreds of guests, rich decor, and music filling the air. Ani, resplendent in her bridal attire, looked every bit the radiant bride, surrounded by her family and friends. The couple exchanged vows in front of their families, promising to build a life filled with love, loyalty, and happiness. For both families, it was a dream come true, a union that symbolized cultural pride, respect, and a shared future. After the wedding, Ani and Shreen set off for a honeymoon in South Africa, a destination known for its breathtaking landscapes and adventure. Their itinerary included Cape Town and the renowned Kruger National Park. As they explored Kruger, they were surrounded by the beauty of the African wilderness, enjoying the luxury of their lodge and the thrill of safari drives. Pictures from this time show the couple smiling, visibly excited by their new life together. It seemed that they had the world at their feet. On November 12, 2010, Ani and Shreen returned to Cape Town, where Shreen arranged for a local driver, Zola Tongo, to guide them around the city. Zola, who was familiar with the area and often drove tourists, was seen as trustworthy by the hotel staff. He drove the couple to various scenic spots, and they felt comfortable with his knowledge and professionalism. Little did anyone know that this simple arrangement would set off a series of events leading to tragedy. On the evening of November 13th, Ani and Shreen enjoyed dinner at the Surfside Restaurant, a quiet spot in Strand, a coastal town outside Cape Town. The evening was peaceful, with the ocean waves providing a serene backdrop. It was a relaxed dinner, filled with the simplicity of newlywed moments. But as they left the restaurant, the night would soon take a dark turn, with an encounter that would change their lives forever. After leaving the restaurant, Ani and Shreen began their journey back to the hotel, unaware of the horror awaiting them. As they drove, two armed men suddenly stopped their taxi and forced their way in, turning a pleasant evening into a terrifying ordeal. The men ordered Zola, the driver, to stop the vehicle and forced him out, leaving Ani and Shreen trapped with the hijackers. The couple was terrified. At some point, the hijackers forced Shreen out of the car, abandoning him on a deserted road, while Ani remained alone with the men as they sped off into the night. This marked the last time Shreen would see her alive. Hours later, police discovered the abandoned vehicle with Ani's lifeless body inside. She had been shot in the neck, a single bullet that ended her life. Her body showed signs of struggle, and the crime scene told a story of betrayal and violence. The gruesome discovery sent shockwaves through her family and community, sparking a massive investigation. South African authorities immediately launched an investigation, Detectives examined the car, looked into potential suspects, and began piecing together Ani's final hours, piecing together the timeline and questioning anyone connected to the couple's trip. The shocking nature of the crime quickly garnered international attention, placing pressure on the police to solve the case. As the investigation into Ani Dawani's murder began, the authorities were met with an overwhelming amount of international interest. Ani's tragic death had quickly become front-page news, raising questions about the motives behind the crime. Police started piecing together a timeline of events based on CCTV footage, cell phone records, and witness statements, leading them toward a chilling possibility. The hijacking had been planned. Early on, they focused on Zola Tongo, the taxi driver, as his behavior during the hijacking raised questions. Why had he been allowed to leave unharmed? As detectives dug deeper, they uncovered a shocking revelation that turned the case upside down. After intense interrogation, Zola Tongo confessed, revealing a sinister plot that left even the investigators shocked and lost for words. According to Tongo, everything was all orchestrated by Sriyan Dawani himself. The plan was to stage a robbery gone wrong, leaving no trail to the murder of his new bride, turning the honeymoon tragedy into an international scandal. The confessions revealed that in the days leading up to the hijacking, Sriyan Dawani reportedly met multiple times with Zola Tongo, the hired driver who had picked up the couple from the Cape Grace Hotel. Investigators later uncovered that Dawani had approached Tongo with a request for assistance in organizing a staged hijacking that would result in Ani's death. Tongo confessed that Dawani offered him a sum of 15,000 South African rand, about $1,500, to arrange for the hit. Tongo, in turn, recruited two accomplices, Mziwama Kwabe and Solil Minjeni, both of whom had prior criminal records and experience with organized crime. As the plan took shape, Sriyan Dawani made arrangements to transfer the agreed payment. According to Zola Tongo, Dawani provided the funds up front in cash, concealing the money in a hidden location for Tongo to collect. After receiving the payment, Tongo coordinated with Kwabe and Minjeni, who were tasked with carrying out the staged hijacking, ensuring that all involved knew the risks and their roles in the fatal plan. On November 13th, the day of the attack, Dawani, Tongo, and the hired gunman kept in close contact via cell phones. Tongo later confessed that Dawani instructed him to follow a specific route through the Gugulethu township on the pretext of sightseeing, but in reality, to position the vehicle for an ambush. This route was known to have sporadic police presence, providing the perpetrators with a low-risk opportunity to execute their crime. On the night of November 13th, Sriyan Dawani and Ani Dawani dined at Surfside Restaurant, unaware of the danger that awaited. After leaving the restaurant, Tongo followed Dawani's instructions and took the designated route through Gugulethu, where Kwabe and Minjeni waited at the agreed spot. The moment they encountered the vehicle, the two hijackers sprang into action, forcing their way into the car with guns drawn. Tongo was ordered out, leaving the newlyweds at the mercy of the armed men. At approximately 11 p.m., Kwabe and Minjeni seized control of the car. They forced Sriyan out shortly after, abandoning him on the roadside, while Ani, now alone with the men, was driven to a secluded location. There, Minjeni, the gunman, shot Ani in the neck, killing her instantly. The men then abandoned the vehicle, leaving Ani's body in the back seat. Police soon arrested two men, Mziwama Kwabe and Zolil Minjeni, who were identified as the hijackers. During their questioning, both men corroborated Tongo's story. Kwabe admitted to being paid for his role and claimed the hijacking was staged to look like a robbery gone wrong. Minjeni, who was accused of pulling the trigger, also confessed to his part, although his statements varied throughout the investigation. When questioned, Kwabe and Minjeni confirmed Tongo's story. They admitted to being hired to carry out the hijacking and to receiving specific instructions on how the crime should be executed. Kwabe explained that he had been the driver, while Minjeni was responsible for shooting Ani. In their statements, Kwabe and Minjeni revealed disturbing details about the murder itself. They claimed Ani had pleaded for her life as they drove her to her death. Despite her fear, they showed no mercy, carrying out the plan precisely as instructed. The chilling testimonies left investigators and the public horrified. In response to the accusations, Sriyan Dawani denied all involvement, insisting that he had no knowledge of the plot. His lawyers argued that Tongo and the hijackers were lying to reduce their sentences. Shrian's defense also pointed out inconsistencies in the suspect's statements, particularly in Minjeni's changing testimonies. This legal defense began a long battle to prevent Shrian's extradition to South Africa. After years of legal battles, Shrian Dewani was extradited to South Africa in 2014 to stand trial. The courtroom became the center of a media storm as the trial of those involved in Ani's murder commenced. Journalists from around the world gathered to cover the unfolding scandal. Shrian Dewani maintained his innocence, asserting that he had no knowledge of any plan to harm his wife, while prosecutors painted a picture of a premeditated crime orchestrated by a husband seeking to escape his marriage. The prosecution presented the testimonies of Tongo, Kwabe, and Mngeni, claiming Shrian had orchestrated the murder. However, the defense worked to discredit the suspects, pointing to their criminal backgrounds and highlighting inconsistencies in their statements. Each suspect had initially claimed different details about the planning and execution of the crime. As the trial progressed, the credibility of the witnesses became a major issue. The defense pointed out that Tongo's confession came with a plea bargain, meaning he had received a lighter sentence for implicating Shrian. They argued that Kwabe and Mngeni, both convicted criminals, were unreliable and had changed their stories. These contradictions weakened the prosecution's case. On the 7th of December 2010, Zola Tongo appeared in the Western Cape High Court in accordance with his plea deal under Section 105A of the Criminal Procedure Act. He pleaded guilty to the armed robbery, kidnapping, and murder of Ani Dewani, crimes he alleged were committed at the behest of Shrian Dewani. According to the terms of his Section 105A agreement, Tongo was sentenced to 18 years in prison, contingent on his testifying truthfully against Dewani in any future legal proceedings. In pretrial hearings on 18th of February at Wynberg Magistrates Court, counsel for Mziwamadoda Kwabe said the court was unable to provide a fair trial for his client, stating that his confessions were more of a statement than a confession, as it was claimed to be giving under duress. According to the terms of his Section 105A agreement, Kwabe was sentenced to 25 years in prison, contingent on his testifying truthfully in future legal proceedings relating to the case. Kwabe will be eligible for release in 2027. In 2011, Mngeni's lawyer Vusi Chabalala said his client had been suffocated with a plastic bag before signing a statement admitting his involvement in the killing, further saying police resorted to irregular methods because of the pressure they were under to solve the high-profile case. Despite having admitted to his role in the robbery and kidnapping of Ani Dewani in a videotaped confession, Mngeni pleaded not guilty at the start of his 2012 trial, saying he had an alibi and was not at the scene of the crime. Mngeni's lawyers said his initial confession should be ruled inadmissible as evidence because it was allegedly extracted using torture. Justice Robert Henney ruled against Mngeni and said the confession was admissible. On the 19th of November 2012, Mngeni was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in jail. The court accepted Mziwamadoda Kwabe's and Monde Mbolombo's version of events, according to which the crime was a contract killing. Mngeni was ruled to have been the person who shot Ani Dewani. In July 2014, it was confirmed that a medical parole application had been made for Mngeni, who was terminally ill with a brain tumor. He was denied parole and died in jail at the Goodwood Center of Excellence on the 18th of October 2014. In April 2014, upon arrival to South Africa from the United Kingdom, Shrian Dewani was arrested, charged, and ordered to stand trial for allegedly arranging the murder of his wife. He was charged with 5 offenses: conspiracy to commit kidnapping, robbery with aggravating circumstances, murder, kidnapping, and obstructing the administration of justice. He pleaded not guilty to all 5 charges. Dewani's trial began on the 6th of October 2014. Under cross-examination, the key witnesses who alleged Dewani's involvement, Zola Tongo, Mziwamadoda Kwabe, and Monde Mbolombo, contradicted their previous statements and each other on most of the key elements of the murder-for-hire story. In the end, justice was only partially served. Although Tongo, Kwabe, and Mngeni received their sentences, the case against Shrian Dewani remained inconclusive. Shrian was found not guilty and was allowed to travel back to the UK. According to reports from 2018, Shreen had moved on and was living with his newfound boyfriend of 18 months. Annie's family, devastated and frustrated, left the courtroom with unanswered questions, grappling with the heartbreak and loss of a beloved daughter and sister. Despite the legal outcome, the mystery of Annie's death continues to linger. Tongo's reduced sentence and Minjini's death in prison left Annie's family with a sense of incomplete justice. The case highlighted gaps in legal processes and stirred global debates on the complexities of extradition, circumstantial evidence, and judicial proceedings in high-profile murder cases. Even today, Annie's family honors her memory, seeking awareness for domestic violence and justice reform. The story of Ani Dewani remains a haunting reminder of life's unpredictability and the consequences of betrayal. While her family continues to seek peace and honor her memory, Ani's legacy endures as a cautionary tale of love, loss, and the quest for justice.
Satisfied with the decision today made by the British justice system, but it's still a long way to the answers that we are looking for, and we don't want to forget Annie in this. For us, it's all about Annie. It's all about finding out what happened to her, and we will fight this battle to the end, and this battle has just begun for us.
If you found this story interesting and you sympathize with Ani Dewani's family, please hit the like button and leave a comment below. Also, don't forget to subscribe for more daily chilling true crime stories on love, betrayal, and revenge. See you on the next one. Chris and Shanann Watts had been together for years. They were the kind of couple that seemed perfect to everyone around them. Good-looking, with 2 young daughters, a beautiful house in Frederick, Colorado, and a life that seemed filled with love and success. To the outside world, their family was everything one could dream of. Shanann was an ambitious woman who worked as a sales representative for a health and wellness company, and she spent a lot of time traveling. Despite her busy schedule, she made sure to stay connected with her family, often posting happy moments on social media to showcase their picture-perfect life. Her posts were filled with joy, from birthday celebrations to family vacations, and it seemed that everything was exactly as it should be. Chris, on the other hand, worked in the oil and gas industry. He was quieter, not as outgoing as Shanann, but no less dedicated. He provided for his family, working long hours at his job as an operator. His co-workers often described him as reserved, but when he was with his family, he was attentive and affectionate. On social media, Chris often appeared as the supportive husband and loving father, always smiling alongside his daughters, Bella and Celeste. To anyone who followed their lives online, they were a family that appeared inseparable. But behind closed doors, things were not as perfect as they seemed. Despite the smiles and the happy photos, the relationship between Chris and Shanann had started to show signs of strain. There were arguments that grew more frequent, and Chris had become distant. Shanann noticed that Chris wasn't as affectionate as he used to be. He wasn't as interested in spending time with her or talking about their future. The emotional connection they once had seemed to be fading, and though Shanann tried to ignore it, she began to feel the changes. Their once strong bond was weakening, and even though they tried to work through it, the emotional distance continued to grow. Chris started spending more time at work, making excuses to avoid family activities. He would tell Shanann he was too tired or that he had to work extra hours, and Shanann, who worked hard herself, tried to understand, but the tension between them only worsened. Shanann had no idea that Chris's distance wasn't just a result of stress or exhaustion. It was something much deeper. Chris was hiding a secret, one that would change everything for their family. As he grew more detached from Shanann, he found someone who seemed to give him what he felt was missing from his marriage. He started an affair that would ultimately lead to a horrific and unimaginable outcome. In the months leading up to the tragic event, Chris and Shanann's relationship had become a battleground of emotions. Shanann would confront him about his coldness, but Chris always denied that anything was wrong. He assured her that everything was fine, that the distance was just a phase. But deep down, he was already emotionally checked out, and the affair he was having was his way of escaping from the responsibilities he no longer wanted to face. As the weeks passed, Chris's relationship with Shanann continued to deteriorate. The tension between them was palpable, yet Shanann held on, hoping that things would improve. She didn't know about the secret that Chris was hiding, a secret that would soon explode and bring their world crashing down. In early 2018, Chris met Nicole Kessinger, a coworker who would soon become the center of his emotional and physical world. Nicole was attractive, younger than Shanann, and seemed to offer Chris a kind of excitement and validation that his marriage no longer provided. At first, their interactions were casual. They spoke here and there at work, but gradually they began texting each other, sharing personal details, and enjoying each other's company outside of the office. Chris began to confide in Nicole about his struggles with Shanann and his unhappiness at home. For Chris, Nicole represented an escape. She didn't have the same expectations of him that Shanann did. She didn't need him to be a father, or a husband, or a provider. Nicole was free of the demands that came with marriage and family. She was carefree and fun, and Chris quickly became captivated by her. Their relationship grew more intense as they spent more time together, talking about their future and making plans. At first, Nicole was unaware that Chris was married. When she found out, it didn't stop her. Chris told her that his marriage was already over, that he was unhappy and just staying in the relationship for the sake of his children. He assured her that he intended to leave Shanann and build a life with her. For Nicole, it was a dream come true. She believed him. She wanted to believe that Chris would eventually leave his wife and be with her. She could sense that he was emotionally distant from Shanann, and she convinced herself that Chris was in love with her, not Shanann. As their affair grew, Chris's behavior at home changed. He became more secretive, less interested in spending time with Shanann, and more focused on his relationship with Nicole. He would go out of his way to avoid conversations with Shanann about their marriage, and when Shanann asked about his emotional distance, Chris would simply tell her that he was tired or stressed. But Shanann felt it. She knew something was wrong, even if she didn't know what. It was becoming increasingly clear that Chris wasn't the man he once was. He had pulled away emotionally, and she didn't understand why. Shanann tried to address the issues in their marriage. She took time to plan special evenings for them, trying to reconnect and rekindle the spark they once had. But every effort was met with resistance. Chris's lack of enthusiasm was hard to ignore. He was physically there, but emotionally, he had checked out. He spent more time working or going on long drives, excusing himself from family gatherings and moments that used to bring him joy. Meanwhile, Nicole was becoming more and more central to his thoughts. Their relationship had progressed to the point where Chris began spending time with her outside of work. He would text her during the day, call her at night, and they even made plans for a future together. Chris began telling Nicole that his marriage was essentially over, but he couldn't leave Shanann just yet. He was stuck. The family he had built was standing in the way of his happiness, or so he convinced himself. Nicole, too, was falling for Chris. She loved the attention he gave her, the compliments, and the way he made her feel special. But as the affair continued, she began to ask more questions. Was he really unhappy in his marriage? Was he really going to leave Shanann for her? Despite her growing doubts, Nicole chose to believe in Chris's promises. She ignored the warnings, the little voice in her head that told her something wasn't right. She wanted a future with him, and she was determined to see it through. Chris, meanwhile, had begun to spiral deeper into the affair, rationalizing his actions as necessary for his happiness. He told himself that the situation at home was untenable, that he had no choice but to leave Shanann. He justified his lies, his cheating, and his emotional abandonment of his family, all in the name of what he felt was his own happiness. The truth was, Chris wasn't just emotionally disconnected from Shanann. He was actively planning to end his marriage, but not in a way anyone would have imagined. He wasn't planning on talking things through or seeking counseling. He wasn't planning on divorcing her in the traditional sense. His plan to leave his family was far darker and more tragic than anyone could have ever anticipated. By mid-August 2018, Chris had convinced himself that his marriage was beyond repair. The distance between him and Shanann had reached an all-time high, and his emotions had become so clouded by his affair with Nicole Kessinger that he could no longer see a way out. He wanted freedom, and in his mind, that freedom could only come by leaving Shanann and his daughters behind. He was no longer the man he once was, and he no longer had any intention of reconciling with Shanann. Chris had become so emotionally detached that he started treating his wife like an obstacle in his life. His feelings of resentment towards Shanann, combined with the promise of a new life with Nickel, pushed him to the brink. He was tired of the lies, the arguments, and the responsibilities of being a husband and a father. It was all too much for him, and in the chaos of his emotions, he believed that his family was holding him back from true happiness. On the night of August 13th, 2018, Chris's internal battle reached its tragic conclusion. Shanann had just returned home from a business trip to Arizona, and she was excited to see her husband and daughters. She had been away for several days, and her excitement to be back with her family was clear. She sent a video to her friends, joking around with the girls and showing off her baby bump. She was pregnant with their third child, a son they planned to name Nico. But when Shanann arrived home that night, the atmosphere in the house was anything but joyful. Chris greeted her with indifference, and his coldness was immediately noticeable. Shanann, though tired from her trip, was eager to reconnect with him. She attempted to talk to him about their relationship, to understand why he had become so distant. But instead of engaging, Chris grew more agitated, and the conversation quickly turned into a confrontation. Shanann wanted answers. She was tired of feeling like an outsider in her own marriage. Chris's anger had been brewing for months, and now it was unleashed. In an emotionally charged moment, he snapped. The argument escalated quickly, and in a fit of rage, Chris strangled Shanann to death. The woman he had once promised to love and cherish was now lifeless on the floor. His hands, the same hands that had once held her lovingly, had taken away her life. In the aftermath, Chris's mind raced. He couldn't believe what he had just done. But his thoughts were not filled with guilt or remorse. He was consumed with fear. Fear of what would happen if anyone found out. Fear of what the authorities would think when they realized Shanann was dead. And fear of the impact this would have on his affair with Nickel. Chris believed that if he could make it look like Shanann had killed the girls and then killed herself, he would be able to walk away without suspicion. As if the death of Shanann wasn't enough, Chris then turned his focus to the two young daughters, Bella and Celeste, who were asleep in their beds, unaware of the horror that had just unfolded in the house. The sisters were so young, so innocent, and yet they too were going to be caught in Chris's violent web of lies. Chris smothered each of them with a pillow, one after the other. The girls never had a chance to scream, to fight back, or to even understand what was happening. In an instant, Chris wiped out the lives of the two little girls he had once claimed to love. He didn't pause for a moment to consider the devastation he was leaving behind. His actions were cold, calculated, and chilling. After the murders, Chris had to figure out what to do with the bodies. He couldn't simply leave them where they were, and he couldn't risk them being found too soon. He placed Shanann's body into the back of his truck, along with the bodies of Bella and Celeste. He drove to the oil site where he worked, an isolated, remote location, and disposed of their bodies. It was there, in the desolate and harsh environment, that he left them to be hidden from the world, believing that his crimes would remain undetected. With the bodies out of sight, Chris drove back to the house and began the facade. He called his mistress, Nickel, and told her about the night's events. He claimed that Shanann had killed the girls and that he had been forced to kill her in self-defense. He wanted Nickel to believe that he was the victim of a terrible tragedy, the innocent man caught up in a nightmare. Meanwhile, the rest of the world had no idea what had happened. Shanann's friends and family grew worried when they couldn't reach her the next morning. They began calling Chris, but he acted as though everything was normal. When Shanann didn't show up for her ultrasound appointment, the alarm bells began ringing. Something was terribly wrong. The morning after the murders, Shanann's friend Nicole Atkinson was the first to grow concerned. She had dropped Shanann off at home the night before, and since she hadn't heard from her, she began to worry. Shanann had a 15-week ultrasound scheduled for that morning, and when she didn't show up for the appointment, Nicole grew frantic. She attempted to reach her friend several times, but there was no answer. Nicole knew something wasn't right. She had seen Shanann's vibrant personality and her constant communication with family and friends. It was unlike her to just vanish without a word. After calling Chris, who seemed unusually calm, Nicole contacted the authorities to report Shanann and the girls as missing. Local law enforcement responded quickly to the case. The police began canvassing the area around Shanann and Chris's home, looking for any signs of a struggle or anything that might lead them to their whereabouts. They knew something was off. Chris's behavior was strange, and his initial statements didn't seem to match the gravity of the situation. As the hours passed, Chris continued to act as though he were a helpless husband, desperate for his family's safe return. He appeared on local news, pleading for information about their whereabouts, even though behind the scenes, he already knew where they were. His emotions seemed disconnected, almost rehearsed. It was as though he was playing a part, a grieving father and husband, desperate to find his family. But to the detectives, there was something about Chris that felt wrong. Detectives began to notice the inconsistencies in Chris's story. His timeline of events didn't add up, and his explanations for Shanann's disappearance kept changing. They found it strange that Chris had seemed so calm when talking about his wife and daughters being missing, especially considering how much they meant to him. His responses were short and emotionless, and the authorities began to wonder if he had something to hide. The investigation quickly moved forward, focusing on Chris. They interviewed neighbors and friends, trying to get a sense of the Watts family's daily routine. They also began to look into Chris's phone and online activity. It didn't take long for investigators to discover the affair. Chris had been communicating with Nicole Kessinger, a co-worker, for months. His behavior around the time of Shanann's disappearance appeared even more suspicious when they realized he had been having an affair with Nicole and had been lying to Shanann about it. The police soon discovered that Chris had been emotionally checked out of his marriage for months. They found messages between him and Nicole that revealed the depth of their relationship and how Chris had been lying to both women. As the investigation unfolded, it became clearer that Chris had a plan. He wanted to start a new life with Nicole, but there were obstacles standing in his way. His wife and daughters were standing in the way of his so-called freedom, and in a moment of selfishness and rage, Chris decided to eliminate those obstacles. Detectives soon turned their attention to the oil field where Chris worked. It was a remote location, and they believed it was the place where Chris had disposed of the bodies. They began searching the area, and it didn't take long before they discovered Shanann's body. It was hidden in the field, placed in a shallow grave. The authorities continued to search the area, and soon after, they found the bodies of Bella and Celeste, Chris's young daughters whose lives had been taken without mercy. The shocking truth began to emerge. The man who had been pleading for his family's safe return was, in fact, their killer. The authorities arrested Chris Watts on suspicion of murder, and his carefully constructed facade as a grieving husband and father began to unravel. As the investigation into the disappearance of Shanann, Bella, and Celeste Watts moved forward, the authorities knew they were getting closer to the truth. Chris Watts, the seemingly distraught husband and father, had been arrested and was in custody. But despite the mounting evidence against him, he still maintained his innocence. Chris's initial statements to the police were full of contradictions, and detectives continued to push him for answers. The moment of truth came during a pivotal interrogation. At first, Chris stuck to his story, telling the police that his wife had killed their daughters and that he had been forced to act in self-defense. He claimed that Shanann had come home late that night, and after an argument, she killed the girls in a fit of rage. He said he had no choice but to kill her in order to protect himself. But as the detectives dug deeper, they didn't believe him. His story just didn't add up, and the evidence pointed in a different direction. The investigators were relentless, and over time, they pieced together a clearer picture of what had happened in the Watts home. They confronted Chris with details that had been uncovered: his affair with Nicole, the inconsistencies in his story, and the discovery of the bodies. They knew that Chris's account of events was a fabrication, and they were closing in on him. Finally, the pressure became too much for Chris to bear. In a moment of overwhelming guilt and fear, he cracked. He admitted to everything. In a heartbreaking confession, Chris told investigators the full, horrifying story. He described how, after Shanann returned home from her business trip that night, they had an argument. According to Chris, he was angry with Shanann for confronting him about his emotional distance, and their conversation escalated. But the argument was not the reason for what happened next. Chris had already made up his mind. In his confession, Chris explained that after the argument, Shanann went to their bedroom and he followed her. He said he strangled her, the woman he had once loved, with his bare hands. When asked why, he could not give a coherent reason. It was clear that the affair with Nickel had clouded his judgment, and in a moment of deep emotional disconnect, Chris felt that the only way out was through violence. But the horror didn't end there. After Shanann was dead, Chris turned his attention to his daughters. Bella and Celeste, who had been asleep in their beds, were now in danger as well. According to Chris, he smothered them with a pillow, one after the other. Their cries and struggles were never heard, and their young lives were taken so suddenly and mercilessly. In a matter of minutes, Chris had destroyed his entire family. The details of Chris's confession were chilling. He spoke of how he had disposed of the bodies at the oil field where he worked, driving his truck to the remote site and hiding Shannan's body in a shallow grave. He placed his daughter's bodies in oil tanks, a final, horrific act of cruelty. When he was done, he drove home, as if nothing had happened, and began his charade of grief. Chris's confession sent shockwaves through the investigation team, but even more so through Shannan's family, friends, and the entire community. The man they had trusted, the man who had appeared to be so devoted to his family, was a cold-blooded killer. The full extent of Chris's crime was now clear. He had murdered his wife and daughters, driven by selfish desires and emotional turmoil, and then tried to cover up his actions. The man who had appeared so normal, so caring, had hidden a dark, violent side that would leave the world in shock. The confession of Chris Watts was just the beginning of a long and painful process that would unfold in the weeks and months to come. As news of the horrific murders spread, the Watts family was thrust into the public eye. What had once seemed like an ordinary suburban family had become the focus of a national tragedy. People everywhere were left wondering, how could this happen? What would lead a man to destroy the lives of his wife and children so brutally? In the days following Chris's arrest, the media coverage exploded. Shannan's family, particularly her parents, Frank and Sandra Zuchek, were devastated. They had lost their daughter and 2 granddaughters, and they now faced the grim reality that the person responsible for their deaths was someone they had trusted. Shannan's friends, who had always admired her strength and resilience, were also reeling from the news. How could someone who had seemed so normal, so loving, commit such an unfathomable act? The police continued to work diligently to piece together the details of the case, while Chris's defense team prepared for his trial. But even before the trial could begin, Chris's confession had already sealed his fate. The prosecution had a wealth of evidence against him, including his own words, the discovery of the bodies, and the forensic evidence that linked him to the crime scene. It was clear that Chris Watts had committed the murders, and his trial would serve as a public reckoning for his horrific actions. In November 2018, Chris Watts was formally charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder, 1 for Shanann, 1 for Bella, and 1 for Celeste. The prosecution also sought additional charges related to the disposal of the bodies and the crimes committed during the commission of the murders. However, despite the overwhelming evidence against him, Chris initially seemed set on pleading not guilty. The legal proceedings dragged on, but Chris's defense team continued to prepare their case. Yet, in the midst of this legal process, a plea deal was offered. The prosecution was willing to accept a plea of guilty in exchange for Chris avoiding the death penalty. After weeks of negotiations, Chris accepted the deal. On November 6, 2018, he appeared in court for a sentencing hearing, where he formally pled guilty to all charges. In an emotional moment, Chris's parents were present in the courtroom, but they were unable to shield him from the devastating consequences of his actions. Shannan's family, especially her parents and brother, were also in the courtroom. They were determined to be there for their daughter and granddaughters, but they struggled to process the reality of the situation. The grief was overwhelming, and there were no words that could possibly explain the depth of their pain. Chris's guilty plea meant that he would face life in prison without the possibility of parole. The sentencing was swift, and the judge declared that Chris Watts would spend the rest of his life behind bars for the brutal murders of his wife and children. It was a sentencing that brought some semblance of justice for Shanann and her daughters, though it could never replace the lives that had been lost. While Chris was sentenced to prison, the Watts family continued to grieve. Shanann's parents, Frank and Sandra, spoke out publicly, calling for justice for their daughter and granddaughters. They had never imagined that their daughter's life would end so violently, and they struggled to come to terms with the betrayal that Chris had committed. In the years following the murders, Shanann's family worked to keep her memory alive. They became outspoken advocates for domestic violence awareness, using their painful experience to educate others about the dangers of emotional abuse and controlling behavior. Shanann's story served as a reminder of how toxic relationships could be hidden behind closed doors, and how important it was to recognize the signs before it was too late. For Chris, life behind bars was a stark contrast to the life he once had. The man who had once been a family man, living in a home with a wife and children, was now alone, serving a life sentence. He would never see his children grow up. He would never have the chance to build a future with Nicole Kessinger, who had believed in him so completely. His life was over in a sense, but it was also a punishment he would have to live with for the rest of his life. As for Nicole, she was left to pick up the pieces of her own life. She had believed Chris's lies, trusted him with her heart, and had even imagined a future with him. In the aftermath of the murders, Nicole faced intense public scrutiny. She had never been involved in the killings, but her relationship with Chris was now forever tainted by his actions. She would forever be associated with one of the most shocking crimes in modern history. The Watts family's tragedy had ripples far beyond the small town of Frederick, Colorado. It sparked conversations about domestic violence, the psychology of emotional manipulation, and the consequences of unchecked rage. People asked how a man could go from seemingly normal to a brutal killer, and what warning signs might have been missed along the way. The case became a symbol of how easily the facade of a happy family could hide the darkest of secrets. As the years passed, the story of Chris Watts, Shanann, and their daughters became an enduring cautionary tale. Shanann's family continued to honor her memory, and while the pain would never fully dissipate, they found solace in knowing that Shanann and her daughters had not been forgotten. The tragic murders of Shanann, Bella, and Celeste Watts would never be erased from the public consciousness, and the consequences of Chris Watts' actions would live on forever. We invite you to share your thoughts in the comments section below. And if you found this story insightful, please subscribe and leave us a like. We would really appreciate that. A young man found brutally slain in his own home, nearly 30 stab wounds, a slit throat, and a gunshot to the head. The killer, his ex-girlfriend, a woman who claimed it was self-defense. But as investigators peeled back the layers of their twisted love story, a shocking truth emerged, one of obsession, jealousy, and a calculated murder. This is the story of Jodi Arias and the brutal killing of Travis Alexander, a crime so shocking it captivated the world. The story of Jodi Arias and Travis Alexander began like any passionate romance, filled with excitement, desire, and the promise of something special. But beneath the surface, their relationship was far from perfect. It was a connection fueled by obsession, jealousy, and manipulation, spiraling toward a violent and tragic end. Travis Alexander was the kind of man people admired. A successful salesman, a devout Mormon, and a motivational speaker, he exuded confidence and charm. He had worked hard to build his life, overcoming a troubled childhood marked by hardship and neglect. By his early 30s, he had everything he wanted: a promising career, a strong circle of friends, and a bright future ahead. Then he met Jodi Arias. Jodi was captivating, strikingly beautiful, artistic, and intelligent. She had an intensity about her that drew people in, but there was something more beneath her charm. She and Travis crossed paths at a work convention in Las Vegas in 2006. The attraction was instant, electric. Within days, they were inseparable. Despite living in different states, Travis in Arizona and Jodi in California, their connection deepened quickly, fueled by late-night phone calls, secret rendezvous, and a whirlwind romance. But there was one problem. Travis was deeply committed to his Mormon faith, and Jodi was not. He believed in saving himself for marriage, yet their relationship was intensely physical, something he struggled to reconcile with his religious beliefs. Jodi, eager to keep him, converted to Mormonism, was baptized, and pledged to follow the faith. To outsiders, it seemed like devotion, but to those who knew her well, it was clear. Jodi was willing to do whatever it took to stay in Travis's life. Their relationship was volatile. They broke up and got back together countless times. Travis saw red flags: her jealousy, her unpredictability, her unwillingness to let go, but he was drawn to her in ways he couldn't fully understand. She showered him with affection, professed her undying love, and gave him everything he wanted. But when things didn't go her way, her sweet demeanor would shift into something darker. Friends of Travis began to notice the warning signs. Jody was always around, too much. She showed up unannounced, hacked into his social media accounts, and read his emails. She monitored his every move, making sure he wasn't seeing other women. When Travis tried to pull away, she pulled him back in, using seduction, guilt, and manipulation to keep their toxic cycle going. By early 2008, Travis had finally had enough. He wanted to move on. He was seeing other women, focusing on his career, and planning for a future without Jody. But Jody wasn't ready to let go. Her obsession deepened, and her jealousy consumed her. If she couldn't have Travis, no one could. What began as a passionate love affair was about to turn into one of the most infamous murder cases in modern history. And in just a few months, Travis Alexander would be dead, brutally slain in his own home. As 2008 unfolded, Travis Alexander was ready to leave Jodi Arias behind for good. He had spent months trying to break free from the toxic cycle of their relationship, but Jodi would not let go. He had started dating other women, searching for someone who aligned with his values and long-term goals. He wanted marriage, stability, and a family, things he knew Jodi could never truly offer him. But Jodi wasn't just a jealous ex-girlfriend. She was an obsessed woman on the verge of unraveling. She refused to accept that their relationship was over. When Travis pulled away, she pushed harder. When he ignored her calls, she bombarded him with voicemails. When he blocked her from his social media accounts, she found ways to break in. Friends began warning Travis that Jodi was dangerous, that she was watching him, following him, creeping into his life in ways that were deeply disturbing. But Travis, despite everything, continued to let her back in. Jodi moved from California to Arizona, settling just a short drive from Travis's house. She told him it was a fresh start, but those closest to Travis knew it was a desperate attempt to stay close to him. She would show up at his house uninvited, let herself in, and sometimes even crawl into his bed at night. It wasn't love anymore. It was control, possession. Despite knowing he needed to stay away, Travis struggled with guilt. He still cared for Jodi, but he didn't love her. She had become a part of his past, but she refused to accept that she wasn't a part of his future. And every time he entertained the idea of keeping her in his life, he fed her obsession just a little more. Then, in May 2008, everything came to a head. Travis was preparing for a big trip to Cancun, Mexico. It was supposed to be a getaway with friends, an escape from the chaos that had been his life with Jodi. And more importantly, he was taking another woman with him, a beautiful, intelligent, and kind woman named Mimi Hall. Unlike Jodi, Mimi was someone Travis could see himself marrying. She was everything Jodi wasn't: stable, confident, and emotionally secure. When Jodi found out about Mimi, something inside her snapped. She had spent the last 2 years molding herself into the woman she believed Travis wanted, yet he was choosing someone else. All of her sacrifices, her relentless pursuit, her desperation, it had been for nothing. She wasn't going to be the one in Cancun. She wasn't going to be the woman Travis built his life with. And most of all, she wasn't going to be the woman he loved. In the days leading up to Travis's murder, Jodi's behavior became increasingly erratic. She dyed her hair dark, rented a car, and began making plans for a road trip. She told friends she was heading to Utah to visit another man, an alibi she meticulously constructed to cover her real intentions. But her true destination was never Utah. It was Travis's house. On June 4th, 2008, Travis Alexander would take his last breath. Jodi was on her way, and she had already decided, if she couldn't have him, no one could. June 4th, 2008 started like any other day for Travis Alexander. He was at home in Mesa, Arizona, going about his routine, unaware that his life was about to end in the most brutal way imaginable. Jodi Arias had been planning this moment. Every move she made, every detail she had considered, it all led to this. She had driven over 1,000 miles, making calculated stops along the way. She dyed her hair brown to alter her appearance, turned off her cell phone to avoid tracking, and even removed her car's license plates temporarily to avoid suspicion. This wasn't a spontaneous crime. This was premeditated murder. When Jodi arrived at Travis's house that evening, it was not a break-in, nor was it an ambush. Somehow, despite everything, Travis let her in. Perhaps he still harbored some residual affection for her, or maybe he simply didn't see her as a threat. Jody had a way of manipulating him, making him drop his guard even when he knew better. What happened over the next several hours remains partially shrouded in mystery, pieced together only by forensic evidence and Jody's ever-changing accounts. But what is certain is that Travis never made it out alive. Travis and Jody spent hours together, taking photos, talking, and, according to evidence, engaging in intimacy. A digital camera captured images of them together, timestamps showing that they were in his bedroom and bathroom throughout the evening. The final photos taken of Travis alive show him in the shower, likely moments before the attack began. Then, the horror unfolded. At some point, something triggered Jody, and her plan went into motion. Travis was caught completely off guard. He was naked, vulnerable, and confined in a small space when she launched her attack. With a knife in hand, she struck, slashing and stabbing him repeatedly. Travis fought back, desperately trying to escape, but Jody was relentless. The attack moved from the bathroom into the hallway, where blood evidence showed his frantic attempt to flee. But Jody didn't stop. She continued stabbing him over and over again until he collapsed. The autopsy would later reveal the shocking extent of her rage. Travis had been stabbed 27 times. His throat had been slit from ear to ear, nearly decapitating him. And in one final act of brutality, Jody shot him in the head. It was overkill, pure and simple. This wasn't just a murder, it was a crime of passion, an explosion of all the anger, jealousy, and obsession Jody had carried inside her. After the murder, Jody didn't run out of the house in a panic. She didn't leave in a hurry. Instead, she meticulously covered her tracks. She dragged Travis's lifeless body back into the shower, likely trying to wash away evidence. She deleted the incriminating photos from the camera, but what she didn't realize was that digital forensics could recover them. She even went as far as to put the blood-soaked camera in the washing machine, hoping to destroy any remaining evidence. Then, she simply left. She drove away from Mesa, disposing of the gun and other evidence along the way. She resumed her carefully crafted alibi, discontinuing her trip to Utah as if nothing had happened. Along the way, she even flirted with another man, laughing and smiling as if she hadn't just butchered someone she once claimed to love. For 5 days, no one knew what had happened to Travis. His friends grew increasingly worried when he missed important work calls and failed to respond to messages. On June 9th, they decided to go to his house, using a spare key to get inside. What they found was a scene straight out of a nightmare. Blood was everywhere, on the walls, the floors, in the bathroom, down the hallway. And then in the shower, they found him. Travis's body was crumpled, his wounds horrifyingly deep, his life stolen in an act of unspeakable violence. The discovery sent shockwaves through the community. Who could have done this? Who hated Travis enough to kill him so brutally? It wouldn't take long before all eyes turned to one person, Jody Arias. The discovery of Travis Alexander's body on June 9, 2008, sent shockwaves through his circle of friends and the broader community. The brutal nature of his murder, a combination of stabbing, shooting, and near decapitation, indicated that this was no random act of violence. It was deeply personal, filled with rage, and most importantly, it was premeditated. Travis's friends had no doubt about who might have done this. The name Jody Arias came up almost immediately when they spoke to the police. They knew about her erratic behavior, her obsessive tendencies, and her refusal to let Travis move on. She had been following him, breaking into his accounts, and showing up uninvited. To them, it seemed obvious. Jody had killed Travis. But at first, investigators had to build their case carefully. They had no immediate proof that Jody was in Arizona at the time of the murder. Her alibi placed her in Utah visiting another man, and on the surface, she seemed cooperative and composed. However, the more police dug into her story, the more inconsistencies they found. The investigation begins. Detectives quickly piece together Travis's final days. Through phone records, text messages, and witness testimonies, they learned that Jody had been in contact with Travis just before his death. But the most damning evidence came from inside his own home. The crime scene was a bloodbath, but within the chaos, detectives found something invaluable: a digital camera that had been tossed into the washing machine. Though Jody had tried to destroy it, forensic experts were able to recover deleted photos. What they found was chilling. The camera contained images of Travis and Jody together on June 4th. Some were intimate, taken in his bedroom. The last photos showed Travis in the shower, moments before he was killed. Then, there were unintentional photos, blurry, dark, but horrifying. One captured Travis bleeding on the floor. Another appeared to have been taken accidentally as his body was being dragged. Jodi had been at the crime scene. There was no denying it now. Police arrested Jodi Arias in California. She initially seemed calm and cooperative, but as detectives pressed her, her story began to unravel. And then, the lies began. At first, Jodi claimed she had nothing to do with Travis's death. She said she hadn't seen him in months and was nowhere near Arizona at the time. But when confronted with the undeniable evidence, her own pictures placing her at the scene, she changed her story. Now, Jodi said she had been there, but she hadn't killed Travis. Instead, she claimed that two masked intruders had broken into the house, attacked them both, and murdered Travis while she barely escaped with her life. She painted herself as a terrified victim who had fled out of fear, too scared to go to the police. But detectives didn't believe a word of it. There were no signs of a break-in, no evidence of anyone else being present, and Jodi herself had no injuries consistent with an attack. Her second lie failed, so she came up with a third. Months later, after sitting in jail and realizing her previous stories weren't working, Jodi changed her narrative again. This time, she admitted to killing Travis, but she claimed it was in self-defense. She said Travis had become enraged, attacking her, forcing her to fight for her life. According to her, he had been abusive, and she had no choice but to kill him. But there was one major problem with this story: the crime scene. Travis had been stabbed 27 times, his throat had been slit, and he had been shot in the head. This wasn't an act of self-defense, it was overkill. The level of violence, the attempt to destroy evidence, and the inconsistencies in Jodi's claims made it clear she wasn't a victim. She was a cold, calculated killer. The public's fascination. As news of the case spread, the media became obsessed with Jodi Arias. She was young, attractive, and intelligent, which made her a rarity among female murder suspects. The press latched onto the case, portraying it as a twisted love story turned deadly. Jodi herself played into this fascination. She gave interviews from jail, speaking in a soft, almost flirtatious manner, as if she were a misunderstood woman instead of a murder suspect. She claimed that no jury would convict her because she was innocent. She smiled for cameras, played with her hair, and acted as though she were the star of a movie rather than a woman accused of a gruesome killing. But behind the scenes, detectives and prosecutors were building an airtight case against her. They had her own photos, her DNA, her lies, and her attempts to manipulate the narrative. They were ready to take her to trial, and the world was about to witness one of the most sensational murder trials in recent history. Jodi Arias had spent years obsessing over Travis Alexander, refusing to let him go. Now she was about to become one of the most infamous killers in modern crime history. By January 2013, Jodi Arias's trial had become a media spectacle. The brutal murder of Travis Alexander, the twisted love story, and Jodi's shifting lies captivated the public. News networks covered every detail, and Jodi, eager for attention, granted multiple interviews from jail. But inside the courtroom, she was no longer in control. The evidence was overwhelming, and the prosecution was ready to expose her web of deception. The prosecution's case. Maricopa County Prosecutor Juan Martinez was relentless in his pursuit of justice for Travis Alexander. He presented a meticulously built case proving that Jodi's actions were premeditated murder, not self-defense. Martinez outlined the overwhelming evidence. Jodi's alibi had changed multiple times. She had staged a burglary at her grandparents' home to steal a .25 caliber gun, the same type used to shoot Travis. She rented a car, turned off her phone, and removed her license plates to avoid detection. She attempted to destroy evidence, including a camera containing images of Travis's final moments. The level of violence, 27 stab wounds, a slit throat, and a gunshot, was far beyond self-defense. Prosecutors argued that Jodi meticulously planned the murder. She couldn't accept Travis moving on, so she ensured he never would. They played the recovered camera footage, showing Travis's final moments in the shower. Then, they displayed blurred images of his lifeless body, proving Jodi was at the crime scene. Jodi's defense team had a nearly impossible task. Their client had lied repeatedly, and the evidence against her was damning. But they stuck to her final story, that she killed Travis in self-defense after enduring years of abuse. Jody took the stand in her own defense, speaking softly and portraying herself as the real victim. She claimed Travis had been emotionally and physically abusive, and that she acted out of fear for her life. Over 18 days of testimony, she attempted to manipulate the jury, but her performance only raised more doubts. She was evasive under cross-examination, contradicting herself multiple times. Her calm demeanor while describing the gruesome killing disturbed many. Then came prosecutor Juan Martinez's turn. He aggressively dismantled her story, exposing her inconsistencies and forcing her to admit to her numerous lies. He proved she had been obsessed with Travis, stalking him, hacking his accounts, and refusing to let him go. The most infamous moment of the trial came when Jody was asked if she preferred the death penalty over life in prison. Previously, she had smugly claimed, "No jury will convict me." Now she backtracked, saying she wanted to live. The contradiction was glaring, reinforcing the prosecution's argument that Jody was a manipulator who would say anything to save herself. After months of testimony, the jury deliberated for days. On May 8, 2013, they reached a unanimous decision. Jody Arias was found guilty of first-degree murder. The courtroom erupted in a mix of emotions. Travis's family sobbed in relief, while Jody barely reacted. The woman who once believed she could outsmart everyone had finally lost control. Now she faced the possibility of the death penalty. But the legal battle wasn't over yet. Next came the sentencing phase. Would Jody Arias receive the ultimate punishment? With Jody Arias convicted of first-degree murder, the next phase of the trial focused on her sentencing. The jury now had to determine whether she would receive the death penalty or life in prison. For Travis Alexander's family, justice had been served with the guilty verdict, but they still had to endure more legal proceedings before the final decision was made. In the aggravation phase, the prosecution had to prove that Jody's crime was especially cruel, heinous, or depraved, criteria necessary to justify the death penalty under Arizona law. Juan Martinez, unwavering in his determination, presented the brutal details of Travis's murder once again. Medical examiners described the extreme pain Travis must have endured. The sequence of wounds, first a deep stab to the chest, then additional stabs, followed by a gunshot to the head, showed a prolonged, torturous attack. The jury listened as Martinez painted a horrifying picture of a man fighting for his life against a relentless killer. When the jury returned their verdict, they unanimously agreed. Jody Arias had murdered Travis Alexander in an especially cruel manner, making her eligible for the death penalty. The defense now had to present mitigating factors to persuade the jury to spare Jody's life. Jody herself took the stand once more, attempting to convince the jury that she had value as a human being and should not be executed. She spoke about her aspirations to help others in prison, promising to teach Spanish and sign language. She even suggested starting a book club and fundraising efforts for domestic violence victims. Her tone was self-serving, as if she were applying for a job rather than facing judgment for a brutal murder. Travis's family, however, delivered powerful victim impact statements. His siblings spoke through tears about the deep emotional wounds Jody had inflicted on their family. They expressed their agony, knowing that Travis's final moments had been filled with terror and suffering. The contrast between Jody's emotionless plea and the family's raw grief was striking. Despite the overwhelming evidence and the Alexander family's heartfelt statements, the jury could not reach a unanimous decision on the death penalty. Arizona law required a unanimous vote, and since they were deadlocked, a new jury was brought in to determine her fate. The retrial of the sentencing phase dragged on for months, further prolonging the suffering of Travis's loved ones. But once again, the second jury could not reach a unanimous decision on the death penalty. Because of this, the final decision fell into the hands of Judge Sherry Stevens. On April 13, 2015, she sentenced Jody Arias to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Though Travis's family had hoped for a death sentence, they took solace in the fact that Jody would never walk free again. Jody Arias was sent to the Arizona Department of Corrections, where she was assigned to Perryville Prison. Behind bars, she continued to seek attention, giving occasional interviews and attempting to portray herself as a misunderstood victim. Despite her claims of remorse, she never truly took responsibility for the horrific nature of her crime. Over the years, she has remained a controversial figure, drawing both supporters and detractors. However, public interest in her case eventually waned, leaving her to live out the rest of her life in a prison cell. The murder of Travis Alexander and the trial of Jodi Arias remain one of the most infamous true crime cases in recent history. The case highlighted issues of domestic violence, media sensationalism, and the psychology of obsession and control. For Travis's loved ones, his memory is preserved not by the horrific crime that ended his life, but by the joy and kindness he shared with others. His family continues to honor him, working to raise awareness about domestic violence and the devastating consequences of toxic relationships. Jodi Arias, once desperate for fame and control, now lives in obscurity. Her story serves as a cautionary tale about the dark consequences of obsession, manipulation, and unchecked rage. Though justice was served, the loss of Travis Alexander remains a painful reminder of a life cut tragically short. We invite you to share your thoughts in the comments section below. And if you found this story insightful, please subscribe and leave us a like. We would really appreciate that.